Sonic Wacky Pack.
Right now, we just having a good time.
Hopefully you had a chance on Wednesday to watch the inauguration of President Biden. Those are always proud moments, I think, in our nation's history. So we thought we'd pause a minute this morning and check in with our good friend Linda Mines, Hamilton County historian and just historian extraordinaire, talking about some other inaugurations in the past that she found noteworthy. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you. It always is just an incredible joy to talk about Inauguration Day. And I've selected a few inaugurations that had some interesting twists that I thought our listeners might be interested in learning more about.
Well, you have me already, the teacher, and you, by saying some interesting twists. What do you mean exactly?
Well, let's start with George Washington. You know, George Washington is the only president who served 2 terms who was sworn in 2 different locations, neither of which was Washington, D.C. He was sworn in for his first inauguration in New York City and his second inauguration in Philadelphia because, of course, during his 2-term presidency, the White House had not been built in Washington, D.C. So I always think that's an interesting one to begin with. Another fact that I think most listeners probably won't believe, but it's actually true, is that Washington, while he was a very wealthy landowner, you know, large plantation there off the Potomac, was what we in the South would call cash poor, land poor. He had to borrow money from a friend to be able to make the trip to New York City for his inauguration.
Wow. Who was the friend? Do we know?
One of his Randolph neighbors there in Virginia was willing to loan him the money.
And did he pay it back, I wonder? Or was it a gift?
I think it probably was a gift. There's no record that Washington or Randolph ever talked about it again. I mean, I think I'd be glad to pay the president's way to his inauguration just so I can have that moment in history, and yet it's one of those historical tidbits that's sort of been lost over the ages.
That's kind of an interesting story. I'll let you get on with the other presidencies to talk about, but we always learn as kids growing up that, you know, the teachers would say, one of you in this room could grow up to become president, right? It can be anyone's goal to achieve.
You know, isn't that a wonderful part of the American dream? And the idea of a republic is that any person who chooses to become that citizen servant leader has that opportunity. And I mean, that's kind of fascinating. I will tell you the second thing that I find really interesting is that, you know, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had been dear friends, had authored the Declaration of Independence together, although Adams would very willingly give Jefferson the credit for having done the yeoman's work in drafting the document. They became political enemies for a period in their life, and when Jefferson was elected president in 1800, succeeding Adams chose not to attend the inauguration. Now, in all fairness, inaugurations were not that big of a deal during that point in our early history. In fact, when John Adams was born in 1796, none of his family came to his inauguration. Was sworn in by himself, bless his heart.
Wow.
You know, it wasn't as big of a deal then, but Jefferson chose, he was staying in a boarding house near C Street, and he chose to walk to his inauguration. That would not occur again until Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. Normally, processional.
Who was the president, Linda, that we always heard about who refused to wear a coat and he died a short time later?
William Henry Harrison, Timothy Tyler, too, you know, the great war hero who, you know, at that point was in his late 60s. People questioned whether or not he was vibrant and youthful enough to be president. He chose to sort of combat that rumor by delivering the longest inaugural address in history, almost 9,000 words, outside in the cold without a coat, caught pneumonia, and died 1 month the day later.
This might be something that you may or may not have the answer to, but you know, we know a lot nowadays about the speech writers because the presidents have so many speeches they have to deliver, they can't possibly write them all. But is the tradition that the president-elect does in fact deliver his own inauguration speech? Does he draft it himself, typically?
And what we believe is that that was typically true up until mid 20th century. We know some of those famous speech writers now, Ted Sorensen, Peggy Noonan, and others. But historically, presidents drafted their own speeches because they saw it as their opportunity to set the tone for their administration. In truth, though, some of those early speeches were not given in person. They were simply printed in the newspapers because of the difficulty in transportation and the fact that inaugural ceremonies were much more quiet, solemn events, with perhaps the exception of Andrew Jackson's, which turned into a lovely free-for-all, sort of a frontier Wild West show in D.C. But the inaugural addresses were always published verbatim the way they had been written in the newspapers across the nation. I'm not sure that we do that any longer.
No, it's a shame that we don't, actually.
I think so. I think it is because, some of our most stirring words from our presidents come during that period of time when they are making the inaugural speech. I mean, I think probably anyone who is my age, you're much too young, Julie, but anyone who's my age remembers John Kennedy's inaugural address, the first president born in the 20th century, which is kind of amazing in itself, but they remember him standing on, those steps, the wind blowing a cold day, sun shining brightly, saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Mm-hmm. And I remember a very, very small child thinking, as I listened to people around me talk about that, what a profound statement that was, because that was so in keeping with the founding of the Republic.
And wouldn't that be an interesting exercise to do for kids, high school kids, as a teacher or as a parent, to present them with 2 or 3 different inaugural speeches, but omit the president's name, and let them see what they find and what they glean and what policies they seem to like, what calls to them, and it would be regardless of party, and see what they actually discern.
That would be a wonderful assignment. And, one of the things that I've always talked about is the fact that words have such power. And some of the most inspiring things in the nation come from the combination of action and words. But it's those words, when, you think about Lincoln and his second inaugural address with "Malice for None," those sorts of statements that still resonate, today, 160 years later, are just so profound. And it's interesting, we talk about presidents using their inaugural address to announce their intentions. James Buchanan, who was elected in 1856, in his inaugural address announced he would not be running for re-election.
Wow.
He was a reluctant president. Quite frankly, he usually rates among the bottom 5 because it was not an office he had particularly desired, but he had felt pressured by the party, and he literally does very, very little as president, which allows the gathering storm clouds preceding Lincoln's inauguration to darken. So Lincoln becomes president, and we're plunged into a civil war. So James Buchanan gets our award for just passing the buck.
That's okay. Somebody has to come in on the bottom rung and somebody on the top, right?
So true. And, different historians rate people differently. That's also sort of a fun activity always. When I taught U.S. presidency, once we would finish the class, I would say, now tell me your 5 top picks. Don't rely on what historians have said, but you have to be able to argue with me the reason you've chosen the individuals you have on the list. And different people and different styles appeal to different students, appeal to different of us as citizens. That's one of the lovely things about the Republic, is that we are a nation of individuals who unite for a common good.
And maybe we can all come back to a point of realizing that words deeply, deeply matter. And if you're going to say something, try to mean it and honor it. And that works for the presidency, and it works for those of us in our own individual everyday lives. Always good to see you, Linda.
Oh, it is so much fun, and, long live the Republic, and let's work to make things better.
For which it stands. I agree with you. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
We're back with more in just a minute.
Seems like CBD stores are popping up on every corner.